The Panar Man-Eater by Jim Corbett. Part 1. While I was hunting the Champawat man-eater in 1907, I heard of a man-eating leopard that was terrorizing the inhabitants of villages on the eastern border of Almora district. This leopard, about which questions were asked in the House of Commons, was known under several names and was credited with having killed 400 human beings. I knew the animal under the name of the Panar Man-Eater, and I shall, therefore, use this name for the purpose of my story. No mention is made in government records of man-eaters prior to the year 1905, and it would appear that until the advent of the Champawat tiger and the Panar leopard, man-eaters in Kumaon were unknown. When therefore these two animals, who between them killed 836 human beings, made their appearance, the government was faced with a difficult situation, for it had no machinery to put in action against them and had to rely on personal appeals to sportsmen. Unfortunately, there were very few sportsmen in Kumaon at that time who had any inclination for this new form of sport, which, rightly or wrongly, was considered as hazardous as Wilson's solo attempt made a few years later to conquer Mount Everest. I, myself, was as ignorant of man-eaters as Wilson was of Everest, and that I succeeded in my attempt, where he apparently failed in his, was due entirely to luck. When I returned to my home in Nainital, after killing the Champawat tiger, I was asked by the government to undertake the shooting of the Panar leopard. I was working hard for a living at the time, and several weeks elapsed before I was able to spare the time to undertake this task. And then, just as I was ready to start for the outlying area of the Almora district in which the leopard was operating, I received an urgent request from Bertud, the Deputy Commissioner of Nainital, to go to the help of the people of Muktesar, where a man-eating tiger had established a reign of terror. After hunting down the tiger, an account of which I have given, I went in pursuit of the Panar leopard. As I had not previously visited the vast area over which this leopard was operating, I went via Almora to learn all I could about the leopard from Stife, the Deputy Commissioner of Almora. He kindly invited me to lunch, provided me with maps, and then gave me a bit of a jolt when wishing me goodbye by asking me if I had considered all the risks and prepared for them by making my will. My maps showed that there were two approaches to the affected area, one via Panvanola on the Pithoragarh road, and the other via Lamgara on the Dabidhura road. I selected this latter route, and after lunch set out in good heart, despite the reference to a will, accompanied by one servant and 4 men carrying my luggage. My men and I had already done a stiff march of 14 miles from Kairna, but being young and fit, we were prepared to do another long march before calling it a day. As the full moon was rising, we arrived at a small, isolated building, which, from the scribbling on the walls and the torn bits of paper lying about, we assumed was used as a school. I had no tent with me, and as the door of the building was locked, I decided to spend the night in the courtyard with my men, a perfectly safe proceeding, for we were still many miles from the man-eater's hunting grounds. This courtyard, which was about 20 feet square, abutted on the public road, and was surrounded on 3 sides by a 2-foot-high wall. On the 4th side, it was bounded by the school building. There was plenty of fuel in the jungle behind the school, and my men soon had a fire burning in a corner of the courtyard for my servant to cook my dinner on. I was sitting with my back to the locked door, smoking, and my servant had just laid a leg of mutton on the low wall nearest to the road and turned to attend to the fire, when I saw the head of a leopard appear over the wall close to the leg of mutton. Fascinated, I sat motionless and watched, for the leopard was facing me, and when the man had moved away a few feet, the leopard grabbed the meat and bounded across the road into the jungle beyond. The meat had been put down on a big sheet of paper, which had stuck to it, and when my servant heard the rustle of paper, and saw what he thought was a dog running away with it, he dashed forward, shouting. But on realizing that he was dealing with a leopard and not with a mere dog, he changed direction and dashed towards me with even greater speed. All white people in the East are credited with being a little mad, for other reasons than walking about in the midday sun, and I am afraid my good servant thought I was a little more mad than most of my kind when he found I was laughing, for he said in a very aggrieved voice, "It was your dinner that the leopard carried away, and I have nothing else for you to eat." However, he duly produced a meal that did him credit, and to which I did as much justice as I am sure the hungry leopard did to his leg of prime mutton. Making an early start next morning, we halted at Lamgara for a meal, and by evening reached the Dole Dak bungalow on the border of the man-eater's domain. Leaving my men at the bungalow, I set out the following morning to try to get news of the man-eater. Going from village to village and examining the connecting footpaths for leopard pug marks, I arrived in the late evening at an isolated homestead consisting of a single stone-built, slate-roofed house, situated in a few acres of cultivated land and surrounded by heavy scrub jungle. On the footpath leading to this homestead, I found the pug marks of a big male leopard. As I approached the house, a man appeared on the narrow balcony, and climbing down a few wooden steps, came across the courtyard to meet me. He was a young man, possibly 22 years of age, and in great distress. It appeared that the previous night, while he and his wife were sleeping on the floor of the single room that comprised the house, with the door open, for it was April and very hot, the man-eater climbed onto the balcony and, getting a grip of his wife's throat, started to pull her head foremost out of the room. With a strangled scream, the woman flung an arm round her husband, who, realizing in a flash what was happening, seized her arm with one hand and, placing the other against the lintel of the door for leverage, jerked her away from the leopard and closed the door. For the rest of the night, the man and his wife cowered in a corner of the room while the leopard tried to tear down the door. In the hot, unventilated room, the woman's wounds started to turn septic, and by morning her suffering and fear had rendered her unconscious. Throughout the day, the man remained with his wife, too frightened to leave her for fear the leopard should return and carry her away, and too frightened to face the mile of scrub jungle that lay between him and his nearest neighbor. As the day was closing down, and the unfortunate man was facing another night of terror, he saw me coming towards the house, and when I had heard his story, I was no longer surprised that he had run towards me and thrown himself sobbing at my feet. A difficult situation faced me. I had not, up to that time, approached the government to provide people living in areas in which a man-eater was operating with first aid sets, so there was no medical or any kind of aid nearer than Almora, and Almora was 25 miles away. To get help for the woman, I would have to go for it myself, and that would mean condemning the man to lunacy, for he had already stood as much as any man could stand, and another night in that room, with the prospect of the leopard returning and trying to gain entrance, would of a certainty have landed him in a madhouse. The man's wife, a girl of about 18 years of age, was lying on her back when the leopard clamped its teeth into her throat, and when the man got a grip of her arm and started to pull her back, the leopard, to get a better purchase, drove the claws of one paw into her breast. In the final struggle, the claws ripped through the flesh, making 4 deep cuts. In the heat of the small room, which had only one door and no windows, and in which a swarm of flies were buzzing, all the wounds in the girl's throat and on her breast had turned septic, and whether medical aid could be procured or not, the chances of her surviving were very slight. So, instead of going for help, I decided to stay the night with the man. I very sincerely hope that no one who reads this story will ever be condemned to seeing and hearing the sufferings of a human being, or of an animal that has had the misfortune of being caught by the throat of either a leopard or a tiger, and not having the means, other than a bullet, of alleviating or of ending the suffering. The balcony, which ran the length of the house, and which was boarded up at both ends, was about 15 feet long and 4 feet wide, accessible by steps hewn in a pine sapling. Opposite these steps was the one door of the house, and under the balcony was an open recess, 4 feet wide and 4 feet high, used for storing firewood. The man begged me to stay in the room with him and his wife, but it was not possible for me to do this, for though I am not squeamish, the smell in the room was overpowering and more than I could stand. So between us we moved the firewood from one end of the recess under the balcony, clearing a small space where I could sit with my back to the wall. Night was now closing in, so after a wash and a drink at a nearby spring, I settled down in my corner and told the man to go up to his wife and keep the door of the room open. As he climbed the steps, the man said, "The leopard will surely kill you, Sahib, and then what will I do?" "Close the door," I answered, "and wait for morning." The moon was 2 nights off the full, and there would be a short period of darkness. It was this period of darkness that was worrying me. If the leopard had remained scratching at the door until daylight, as the man said, it would not have gone far, and even now it might be lurking in the bushes watching me. I had been in position for half an hour, straining my eyes into the darkening night, and praying for the moon to top the hills to the east, when a jackal gave its alarm call. This call, which is given with the full force of the animal's lungs, can be heard for a very long distance, and can be described as repeated over and over again, as long as the danger that has alarmed the jackal is in sight. Leopards, when hunting or when approaching a kill, move very slowly, and it would be many minutes before this one, assuming it was the man-eater, covered the half-mile between us, and even if in the meantime the moon had not risen, it would be giving sufficient light to shoot by, so I was able to relax and breathe more freely. Minutes dragged by. The jackal stopped calling. The moon rose over the hills, flooding the ground in front of me with brilliant light. No movement to be seen anywhere, and the only sound to be heard in all the world, the agonized fight for breath of the unfortunate girl above me. Minutes gave way to hours. The moon climbed the heavens and then started to go down in the west, casting the shadow of the house on the ground I was watching. Another period of danger, for if the leopard had seen me, he would, with the leopard's patience, be waiting for these lengthening shadows to mask his movements. But nothing happened, and one of the longest nights I have ever watched through came to an end when the light from the sun lit up the sky where 12 hours earlier the moon had risen. The man, after his vigil of the previous night, had slept soundly, and as I left my corner and eased my aching bones, only those who have sat motionless on hard ground for hours know how bones can ache, he came down the steps. Except for a few wild raspberries, I had eaten nothing for 24 hours, and as no useful purpose would have been served by my remaining any longer, I bade the man goodbye, and set off to rejoin my men at the Dole Dak bungalow 8 miles away, and summon aid for the girl. I had only gone a few miles when I met my men. Alarmed at my long absence, they had packed up my belongings, paid my dues at the Dak bungalow, and then set out to look for me. While I was talking to them, the road overseer, whom I have mentioned in my story of the temple tiger, came along. He was well mounted on a sturdy bhutia pony, and as he was on his way to Almora, he gladly undertook to carry a letter from me to Stipe. Immediately on receipt of my letter, Stipe dispatched medical aid for the girl, but her sufferings were over when it arrived. It was this road overseer who informed me about the human kill that took me to Devi Thura, where I met with one of the most interesting and the most exciting shikar experiences I have ever had. After that experience, I asked the old priest of the Devidhura temple if the man-eater had as effective protection from his temple as the tiger I had failed to shoot, and he answered, No, Sahib. This shaitan, or devil, has killed many people who worshipped at my temple, and when you come back to shoot him, as you say you will, I shall offer up prayers for your success morning and evening. Part 2. No matter how full of happiness our life may have been, there are periods in it that we look back to with special pleasure. Such a period for me was the year 1910, for in that year I shot the Muktesar man-eating tiger and the Panar man-eating leopard, and in between these two, for me, great events, my men and I set up an all-time record at Mokame Ghat by handling, without any mechanical means, 5,500 tons of goods in a single working day. My first attempt to shoot the Panar leopard was made in April of 1910, and it was not until September of the same year that I was able to spare the time to make a second attempt. I have no idea how many human beings were killed by the leopard between April and September, for no bulletins were issued by government, and beyond a reference to questions asked in the House of Commons, no mention of the leopard, as far as I am aware, was made in the Indian press. The Panar leopard was credited with having killed 400 human beings against 125 killed by the Rudraprayag leopard. And the fact that the former received such scant publicity while the latter was headline news throughout India was due entirely to the fact that the Panar leopard operated in a remote area far from the beaten track, whereas the Rudraprayag leopard operated in an area visited each year by 60,000 pilgrims, ranging from the humblest in the land to the highest, all of whom had to run the gauntlet of the man-eater. It was these pilgrims and the daily bulletins issued by government that made the Rudraprayag leopard so famous, although it caused far less human suffering than the Panar leopard. Accompanied by a servant and 4 men carrying my camp kit and provisions, I set out from Nainital on 10th of September on my second attempt to shoot the Panar leopard. The sky was overcast when we left home at 4 a.m., and we had gone a few miles when a deluge of rain came on. Throughout the day it rained, and we arrived at Almora after a 28-mile march, wet to the bone. I was to have spent the night with Stife, but not having a stitch of dry clothing to put on, I excused myself and spent the night at the dak bungalow. There were no other travelers there, and the man in charge very kindly put 2 rooms at my disposal with a big wood fire in each, and by morning my kit was dry enough for me to continue my journey. It had been my intention to follow the same route from Almora that I had followed in April and start my hunt for the leopard from the house in which the girl had died of her wounds. While I was having breakfast, a mason by the name of Panwa, who did odd jobs for us in Nainital, presented himself. Panwa's home was in the Panar Valley, and on learning from my men that I was on my way to try to shoot the man-eater, he asked for permission to join our party, for he wanted to visit his home and was frightened to undertake the journey alone. Panwa knew the country, and on his advice, I altered my plans, and instead of taking the road to Devidhura via the school where the leopard had eaten my dinner, I took the road leading to Pithoragarh. Spending the night at the Panwanaula dak bungalow, we made an early start next morning, and after proceeding a few miles, left the Pithoragarh road for a track leading off to the right. We were now in the man-eater's territory, where there were no roads, and where the only communication was along footpaths running from village to village. Progress was slow, for the villages were widely scattered over many hundreds of square miles of country, and as the exact whereabouts of the man-eater were not known, it was necessary to visit each village to make inquiries. Going through Salan and Rangot Pattis, a group of villages, I arrived late on the evening of the 4th day at Chakati, where I was informed by the headman that a human being had been killed a few days previously at a village called Sanoli on the far side of the Panar River. Owing to the recent heavy rain, the Panar was in flood, and the headman advised me to spend the night in his village, promising to give me a guide next morning to show me the only safe ford over the river, for the Panar was not bridged. The headman and I had carried on our conversation at one end of a long row of double-storied buildings, and when, on his advice, I elected to stay the night in the village, he said he would have 2 rooms vacated in the upper story for myself and my men. I had noticed, while talking to him, that the end room on the ground floor was untenanted, so I told him I would stay in it, and that he need only have 1 more room vacated in the upper story for my men. The room I had elected to spend the night in had no door, but this did not matter, for I had been told that the last kill had taken place on the far side of the river, and I knew the man-eater would not attempt to cross the river while it was in flood. The room had no furniture of any kind, and after my men had swept all the straw and bits of rags out of it, complaining as they did so that the last tenant must have been a very dirty person, they spread my ground sheet on the mud floor and made up my bed. I ate my dinner, which my servant cooked on an open fire in the courtyard, sitting on my bed, and as I had done a lot of walking during the 12 hours I had been on my feet, it did not take me long to get to sleep. The sun was just rising next morning, flooding the room with light, when on hearing the slight sound in the room, I opened my eyes and saw a man sitting on the floor near my bed. He was about 50 years of age, and in the last stage of leprosy. On seeing that I was awake, this unfortunate living death said he hoped I had spent a comfortable night in his room. He went on to say that he had been on a 2 days visit to friends in an adjoining village, and finding me asleep in his room on his return, had sat near my bed and waited for me to awake. Now, leprosy is the most terrible and the most contagious of all diseases in the East, and is very prevalent throughout Kumaon, and especially bad in the Almora district. Being fatalists, the people look upon the disease as a visitation from God, and neither segregate the afflicted nor take any precautions against infection. So, quite evidently, the headman did not think it was necessary to warn me that the room I had selected to stay in had for years been the home of a leper. It did not take me long to dress that morning, and as soon as our guide was ready, we left the village. Moving about as I have done in Kumaon, I have always gone in dread of leprosy, and I have never felt as unclean as I did after my night in that poor unfortunate's room. At the first stream we came to, I called a halt for my servant to get breakfast ready for me, and for my men to have their food. Then, telling my men to wash my ground sheet and lay my bedding out in the sun, I took a bar of carbolic soap and went down the stream to where there was a little pool surrounded by great slabs of rock. Taking off every stitch of clothing I had worn in that room, I washed it all in the pool, and after laying it out on the slabs of rocks, I used the remainder of the soap to scrub myself as I had never scrubbed myself before. 2 hours later, in garments that had shrunk a little from the rough treatment they had received, I returned to my men feeling clean once again, and with a hunter's appetite for breakfast. Our guide was a man about 4 foot 6 inches tall, with a big head crowned with a mop of long hair, a great barrel of a body, short legs, and few words. When I asked him if we had any stiff climbing to do, he stretched out his open hand and answered, "Flat as that." Having said this, he led us down a very steep hill into a deep valley. Here I expected him to turn and follow the valley down to its junction with the river. But no, without saying a word or even turning his head, he crossed the open ground and went straight up the hill on the far side. This hill, in addition to being very steep and overgrown with thorn bushes, had loose gravel on it which made the going difficult. And as the sun was now overhead and very hot, we reached the top in a bath of sweat. Our guide, whose legs appeared to have been made for climbing trees, had not turned a hair. There was an extensive view from the top of the hill, and when our guide informed us that we still had the two high hills in the foreground to climb before reaching the Panar River, Panwa, the mason who was carrying a bundle containing presents for his family and a great coat made of heavy dark material, handed the coat to the guide and said that as he was making us climb all the hills in Kumau, he could carry the coat for the rest of the way. Unwinding a length of goat hair cord from round his body, the guide folded up the coat and strapped it securely to his back. Down and up we went, and down and up again, and then away down in a deep valley we saw the river. So far we had been going over trackless ground, without a village in sight, but we now came on a narrow path running straight down to the river. The nearer we got to the river, the less I liked the look of it. The path leading to the water and up the far side showed that there was a ford here, but the river was in flood and the crossing appeared to me to be a very hazardous one. The guide assured us, however, that it was perfectly safe to cross. So removing my shoes and stockings, I linked arms with Panwa and stepped into the water. The river was about 40 yards wide, and from its broken surface, I judged it was running over a very rough bed. In this I was right, and after stubbing my toes a few times, and narrowly avoiding being washed off our feet, we struggled out on the far bank. Our guide had followed us into the river, and on looking back I saw that the little man was in difficulties. The water, which for us had been thigh-deep, was for him waist-deep, and on reaching the main stream, instead of bracing his back against it and walking crab fashion, he very foolishly faced upstream, with the result that he was swept over backwards and submerged under the fast-running current. I was barefoot and helpless on the sharp stones, but Panwa, to whom sharp stones were no obstacle, threw down the bundle he was carrying and without a moment's hesitation sprinted along the bank to where, 50 yards farther down, a big slab of rock jutted into the river at the head of a terrifying rapid. Running out onto this wet and slippery rock, Panwa lay down, and as the drowning man was swept past, he grabbed him by his long hair and after a desperate struggle drew him onto the rock. When the two men rejoined me, the guide looking like a drowned rat, I complimented Panwa on his noble and brave act in having saved the little man's life, at great risk to his own. After looking at me in some surprise, Panwa said, "Oh, it was not his life that I wanted to save, but my new coat that was strapped to his back." Anyway, whatever the motive, a tragedy had been averted, and after my men had linked arms and crossed safely, I decided to call it a day and spend the night on the river bank. Panwa, whose village was 5 miles farther up the river, now left me, taking with him the guide who was frightened to attempt a second crossing of the river. Part 3. Next morning, we set out to find Sanauli, where the last human kill had taken place. Late in the evening of that day, we found ourselves in a wide open valley, and as there were no human habitations in sight, we decided to spend the night on the open ground. We were now in the heart of the man-eater's country, and after a very unrestful night, spent on cold, wet ground, arrived about midday at Sanauli. The inhabitants of this small village were overjoyed to see us, and they very gladly put a room at the disposal of my men, and gave me the use of an open platform with a thatched roof. The village was built on the side of a hill overlooking a valley in which there were terraced fields, from which a paddy crop had recently been harvested. The hill on the far side of the valley sloped up gradually, and 100 yards from the cultivated land there was a dense patch of brushwood, some 20 acres in extent. On the brow of the hill above this patch of brushwood there was a village, and on the shoulder of the hill to the right another village. To the left of the terraced fields, the valley was closed in by a steep, grassy hill. So, in effect, the patch of brushwood was surrounded on 3 sides by cultivated land, and on the 4th side by open grassland. While breakfast was being made, the men of the village sat round me and talked. During the second half of March and the first half of April, 4 human beings had been killed in this area by the man-eater. The first kill had taken place in the village on the shoulder of the hill, the second and third in the village on the brow of the hill, and the fourth in Sanauli. All 4 victims had been killed at night and carried some 500 yards into the patch of brushwood where the leopard had eaten them at his leisure. For having no firearms, the inhabitants of the 3 villages were too frightened to make any attempt to recover the bodies. The last kill had taken place 6 days before, and my informants were convinced that the leopard was still in the patch of brushwood. I had purchased 2 young male goats in a village we passed through earlier that day, and towards evening I took the smaller one and tied it at the edge of the path of brushwood to test the villagers' assertion that the leopard was still in the cover. I did not sit over the goat, because there were no suitable trees nearby, and also because clouds were banking up and it looked as though there might be rain during the night. The platform that had been placed at my disposal was open all round, so I tied the second goat near it in the hope that if the leopard visited the village during the night, it would prefer a tender goat to a tough human being. Long into the night, I listened to the 2 goats calling to each other. This convinced me that the leopard was not within hearing distance. However, there was no reason why he should not return to the locality, so I went to sleep hoping for the best. There was a light shower during the night, and when the sun rose in a cloudless sky, every leaf and blade of grass was sparkling with raindrops, and every bird that had a song to sing was singing a joyful welcome to the day. The goat near my platform was contentedly browsing off a bush and bleating occasionally, while the one across the valley was silent. Telling my servant to keep my breakfast warm, I crossed the valley and went to the spot where I had tied up the smaller goat. Here I found that sometime before the rain came on, a leopard had killed the goat, broken the rope, and carried away the kill. The rain had washed out the drag mark, but this did not matter, for there was only one place to which the leopard could have taken his kill, and that was the dense patch of brushwood. Stalking a leopard or a tiger on its kill is one of the most interesting forms of sport I know of, but it can only be indulged in with any hope of success when the conditions are favorable. Here the conditions were not favorable, for the brushwood was too dense to permit of a noiseless approach. Returning to the village, I had breakfast and then called the villagers together, as I wanted to consult them about the surrounding country. It was necessary to visit the kill to see if the leopard had left sufficient for me to sit over, and while doing so, I would not be able to avoid disturbing the leopard. What I wanted to learn from the villagers was whether there was any other heavy cover within a reasonable distance to which the leopard could retire on being disturbed by me. I was told that there was no such cover nearer than 2 miles, and that to get to it the leopard would have to cross a wide stretch of cultivated land. At midday I returned to the patch of brushwood, and 100 yards from where he had killed it, I found all that the leopard had left of the goat, its hooves, horns, and part of its stomach. As there was no fear of the leopard leaving the cover at that time of day for the jungle 2 miles away, I tried for several hours to stalk it, helped by bulbuls, drongos, thrushes, and scimitar babblers, all of whom kept me informed of the leopard's every movement. In case any should question why I did not collect the men of the 3 villages and get them to drive the leopard out onto the open ground, where I could have shot it, it is necessary to say that this could not have been attempted without grave danger to the beaters. As soon as the leopard found he was being driven towards open ground, he would have broken back and attacked anyone who got in his way. On my return to the village, after my unsuccessful attempt to get a shot at the leopard, I went down with a bad attack of malaria, and for the next 24 hours, I lay on the platform in a stupor. By the evening of the following day, the fever had left me, and I was able to continue the hunt. On their own initiative, the previous night, my men had tied out the second goat, where the first had been killed, but the leopard had not touched it. This was all to the good, for the leopard would now be hungry, and I set out on that third evening full of hope. On the near side of the patch of brushwood, and about 100 yards from where the goat had been killed 2 nights previously, there was an old oak tree. This tree was growing out of a 6-foot-high bank between 2 terraced fields, and was leaning away from the hill at an angle that made it possible for me to walk up the trunk in my rubber-soled shoes. On the underside of the trunk, and about 15 feet from the ground, there was a branch jutting out over the lower field. This branch, which was about a foot thick, offered a very uncomfortable and a very unsafe seat, for it was hollow and rotten. However, as it was the only branch on the tree, and as there were no other trees within a radius of several 100 yards, I decided to risk the branch. As I had every reason to believe, from the similarity of the pug marks I had seen in the brushwood to those I had seen in April on the path leading to the homestead where the girl was killed, that the leopard I was dealing with was the Panar Man-Eater, I made my men cut a number of long blackthorn shoots. After I had taken my seat with my back to the tree and my legs stretched out along the branch, I made the men tie the shoots into bundles and lay them on the trunk of the tree and lash them to it securely with strong rope. To the efficient carrying out these small details, I am convinced I owe my life. Several of the blackthorn shoots, which were from 10 to 20 feet long, projected on either side of the tree, and as I had nothing to hold on to maintain my balance, I gathered the shoots on either side of me and held them firmly pressed between my arms and my body. By 5 o'clock, my preparations were complete. I was firmly seated on the branch with my coat collar pulled up well in front to protect my throat, and my soft hat pulled down well behind to protect the back of my neck. The goat was tied to a stake, driven into the field 30 yards in front of me, and my men were sitting out in the field, smoking and talking loudly. Up to this point, all had been quiet in the patch of brushwood, but now a scimitar babbler gave its piercing alarm call, followed by a minute or two later by the chattering of several white-throated laughing thrushes. These 2 species of birds are the most reliable informants in the hills, and on hearing them I signaled to my men to return to the village. This they appeared to be very glad to do, and as they walked away, still talking loudly, the goat started bleating. Nothing happened for the next half hour, and then, as the sun was fading off the hill above the village, 2 drongos that had been sitting on the tree above me flew off and started to bait some animal on the open ground between me and the patch of brushwood. The goat, while calling, had been facing in the direction of the village, and it now turned round, facing me, and stopped calling. By watching the goat I could follow the movements of the animal that the drongos were baiting, and that the goat was interested in, and this animal could only be a leopard. The moon was in her 3rd quarter, and there would be several hours of darkness. In anticipation of the leopard's coming, when light conditions were not favorable, I had armed myself with a 12-bore, double-barreled shotgun loaded with slugs, for there was a better chance of my hitting the leopard with 8 slugs than with a single rifle bullet. Aids to night shooting in the way of electric lights and torches were not used in India at the time I am writing about, and all that one had to rely on for accuracy of aim was a strip of white cloth tied around the muzzle of the weapon. Again, nothing happened for many minutes, and then I felt a gentle pull on the blackthorn shoots I was holding, and blessed my forethought in having had the shoots tied to the leaning tree, for I could not turn round to defend myself, and at best the collar of my coat and my hat were poor protection. No question now that I was dealing with a man-eater, and a very determined man-eater at that. Finding that he could not climb over the thorns, the leopard, after his initial pull, had now got the butt ends of the shoots between his teeth and was jerking them violently, pulling me hard against the trunk of the tree. And now the last of the daylight faded out of the sky, and the leopard, who did all his human killings in the dark, was in his element, and I was out of mine. For in the dark, a human being is the most helpless of all animals, and, speaking for myself, his courage is at its lowest ebb. Having killed 400 human beings at night, the leopard was quite unafraid of me, as was evident from the fact that while tugging at the chutes, he was growling loud enough to be heard by the men anxiously listening in the village. While this growling terrified the men, as they told me later, it had the opposite effect on me, for it let me know where the leopard was and what he was doing. It was when he was silent that I was most terrified, for I did not know what his next move would be. Several times he had nearly unseated me by pulling on the chutes vigorously and then suddenly letting them go. And now that it was dark and I had nothing stable to hold on to, I felt sure that if he sprang up, he would only need to touch me to send me crashing to the ground. After one of these nerve-wracking periods of silence, the leopard jumped down off the high bank and dashed towards the goat. In the hope that the leopard would come while there was still sufficient light to shoot by, I had tied the goat 30 yards from the tree to give me time to kill the leopard before it got to the goat. But now, in the dark, I could not save the goat, which, being white, I could only just see as an indistinct blur, so I waited until it had stopped struggling and then aimed where I thought the leopard would be, and pressed the trigger. My shot was greeted with an angry grunt, and I saw a white flash as the leopard went over backwards and disappeared down another high bank into the field beyond. For 10 or 15 minutes, I listened anxiously for further sounds from the leopard, and then my men called out and asked if they should come to me. It was now quite safe for them to do so, provided they kept to the high ground. So I told them to light pine torches and thereafter carry out my instructions. These torches, made of 12 to 18 inches long splinters of resin-impregnated pine wood cut from a living tree, give a brilliant light and provide the remote villages in Kumaon with the only illumination they have ever known. After a lot of shouting and running about, some 20 men, each carrying a torch, left the village, and following my instructions, circled round above the terraced fields and approached my tree from behind. The knots in the ropes securing the blackthorn shoots to the tree had been pulled so tight by the leopard that they had to be cut. After the thorns had been removed, men climbed the tree and helped me down, for the uncomfortable seat had given me cramp in my legs. The combined light from the torches lit up the field on which the dead goat was lying, but the terraced field beyond was in shadow. When cigarettes had been handed round, I told the men I had wounded the leopard, but did not know how badly, and that we would return to the village now, and I would look for the wounded animal in the morning. At this, great disappointment was expressed. "Sahib, if you have wounded the leopard, it must surely be dead by now. There are many of us, and you have a gun, so there is no danger. At least let us go as far as the edge of the field and see if the leopard has left a blood trail." After all arguments for and against going to look for the leopard immediately had been exhausted, I consented against my better judgment to go as far as the edge of the field, from where we could look down on the terraced field below. Having acceded to their request, I made the men promise that they would walk in line behind me, hold their torches high, and not run away and leave me in the dark if the leopard charged. This promise they very willingly gave, and after the torches had been replenished and were burning brightly, we set off, I walking in front and the men following 5 yards behind. 30 yards to the goat, and another 20 yards to the edge of the field. Very slowly and in silence we moved forward. When we reached the goat, no time now to look for a blood trail, the farther end of the lower field came into view. The nearer we approached the edge, the more of this field became visible. And then, when only a narrow strip remained in shadow from the torches, the leopard, with a succession of angry grunts, sprang up the bank and into full view. There is something very terrifying in the angry grunt of a charging leopard, and I have seen a line of elephants that were staunch to tiger turn and stampede from a charging leopard. So I was not surprised when my companions, all of whom were unarmed, turned as one man and bolted. Fortunately for me, in their anxiety to get away, they collided with each other, and some of the burning splinters of pine, held loosely in their hands, fell to the ground and continued to flicker, giving me sufficient light to put a charge of slugs into the leopard's chest. On hearing my shot, the men stopped running, and then I heard one of them say, "Oh no, he won't be angry with us, for he knows that this devil has turned our courage to water." Yes, I knew, from my recent experience on the tree, that fear of a man-eater robs a man of courage. As for running away, had I been one of the torch-bearers, I would have run with the best. So there was nothing for me to be angry about. Presently, while I was making believe to examine the leopard, to ease their embarrassment, the men returned in 2s and 3s. When they were assembled, I asked, without looking up, "Did you bring a bamboo pole and rope to carry the leopard back to the village?" "Yes," they answered eagerly. "We left them at the foot of the tree." "Well, go and fetch them," I said, "for I want to get back to the village for a cup of hot tea." The cold night wind, blowing down from the north, had brought on another attack of malaria, and now that all the excitement was over, I was finding it difficult to remain on my feet. That night, for the first time in years, the people of Sanoli slept, and have continued to sleep, free from fear. The end.